there is something deceptively simple about the idea of a wish. It carries with it the assumption that desire can be fulfilled and that the world around you is capable of responding to what you lack. In most stories throughout history, especially those aimed at younger audiences, wishes always would have some sort of rule set, which creates the difficulty or trade-off that wish being fulfilled. Madoka Magica is a show whose wishes come with no apparent consequences. It's a magical girl series that fundamentally centers on the idea of wishing for something, and it's something that fascinated me since the first time I've heard about it. There was a lot of hype built around this little slice of anime, from it having countless video essays praising its subversive nature to people calling it a straight masterpiece. So eventually, as a fan of the medium myself, I had to give in and give it a watch myself to confirm all that was being said about it in online spaces. I was pretty much absorbed by the beginning episode of the series and its inherent strangeness of the witch's domain. But what I found odd was the number of voices in the online spaces lauding the work as an undefeated masterpiece, a perfect work of no flaws. By the time I finished it, I was left in a much more conflicted position. There were aspects of it that I genuinely liked, but also others that felt fundamentally unsatisfying. And more than anything, I felt the need to sit down and understand why. Yet, the more I looked online and the more I thought about my feelings, I found it increasingly difficult to understand why valid criticism or complaints anyone has ever lobbed towards the series is met permanently with a sea of downvotes and angry rants made by rabid fans, by people who refuse to acknowledge even partially that something they may like may have flaws. Still, in spite of that and my lack for a better term lapse of judgment, I knew I would end up with the same fate if I tried. Yet still, I've decided today to try and explain my gripes with it. This video is essentially that process, the process of creating my own version of an ultimate critique of Madoka Magica. A recollection and most importantly, a subjective opinion essay about my apparent problems and caveats with the series. Most of what I'm going to talk about comes down to the writing itself, so that will be the central focus of this video, with occasional detours into other elements only when they become absolutely relevant. Now, we cannot talk about the writing itself without addressing the massive elephant in the room, that being that the story of Madoka Magica is written entirely by Gen Urobuchi. And this is important not in the sense that knowing the author explains everything I'm about to criticize, but because Urobuchi tends to approach stories in a very particular way, which I find quite frustrating. I've unfortunately seen it done in other works written by him. I was quite familiar with him from before. I know he made Sayano Uta, I know he wrote Psycho-Pass, which I remember disliking terribly for many the same reasons I had problems with Madoka for. He also wrote the anime adaptation of Fate Zero, which also falls into the certain ballpark, and what I mean by that is they're all quote-unquote tragedies. My problem with his writing style in particular is that he writes tragedies, as he himself and everybody who reads him can say, tragedies meaning he tries to make his characters akin to the Greek myths of Odysseus and Achilles, in that the endings are always bittersweet or tragic, and then there's a lot of suffering involved. I find no issue with stories that have dark themes or even an abundance of suffering, it's just the way he tends to write and the execution itself. The way he does that is by having characters dramatically shift their personalities entirely. Characters in his stories just have this thing where they can act entirely irrational if it helps tie them closer to an emotional plot point. You'll see that a lot throughout the spread runtime, but for now, let's take it from the beginning by starting by breaking down the first few episodes of the series. The series begins with a variety of interesting visuals, representing an abstract space as the main character, Madoka, runs down some stairs only to meet up with yet another character who will later be introduced as Homura. Homura is currently fighting a world-ending threat. A cat appears before Madoka and offers her the opportunity to save the world by turning into a magical girl. But just before she manages to say anything, she wakes up in her bed. This opening section already manages to pose a problem towards the overall narrative, and that is, early on, all the foreshadowing that's built right from the start up to over halfway through the show gives far too much away. From this scene alone we get a premonition-like view of the end of it. We see Homura and we also see a cat named Kyubei who immediately arouses suspicion. It also forms a definite idea in the viewer's head that either Madoka was sent back in time or this is simply a view into the future and what is about to occur. The reason I gravitated towards the first is simply because Homura shows up the same episode and immediately acts like she knows everything. Not only about Madoka, but about being a magical girl and everyone else around her. The problem here arises mostly from the fact the story beats are extremely, and I mean extremely obvious and predictable, right from the very start. Fact displayed throughout the entire central mystery, which permeates the series. It's not really intentional either, not the way Urobochi wanted it to be, and even after you figured something out and you get to the end of that plot point, it usually just turns out whatever preconception you'd made in your head is usually 100% true. It doesn't subvert your expectations thereafter, not in any meaningful way. It's also a problem with making the outright antagonistic creature way too obvious. I don't think I had a single moment in the story where I trusted Kyubei, simply because it's not only cryptic and robotic, but immediately opposes Homura as the story just begins to unfold. Homura's distrust after she's shown to be risking her life saving the world at the beginning of the story makes it really hard to come around to a creature that is seemingly granting wishes with no apparent downside to them, other than to begin saving people by killing evil witches in the process. It's not only that, but the moment Homura also appears, she immediately warns Madoka about the dangers of contracting creatures like Kyubei, and tells her that a contract might as well result in the loss of all people she holds dear. There are simply far too many signs to not bring the most primal distrust towards this thing. Even leaving aside its appearances, which, while trying to be cute, have too much of a sinister edge to them to be passable as a hidden antagonist. This same episode, the main cast is fully introduced for the most part, and some light archetypes are generally established, with Madoka being the damsel in distress, Sayaka being the determined one, Homura the experienced veteran, and so on and so forth. They also introduce our first other magical girl in the form of Mami, an older senior who appears as their mentor early on. She's also rather the most naive of them, since she immediately believes every word that comes out of Kyubei's mouth. Not that all of what he says is a lie, but a lot of the concepts straight up spoil elements of the story before they even get the chance to be introduced. For example, a soul gem is an object created whenever a civilian turns into a magical girl. It clearly, from its name, denotes that it contains a soul. The most obvious answer to that without doing any mental gymnastics is their soul. So early on, even before finding out that the soul gem contains their soul, it's very easy to tie the dots together. Even if you were to doubt Kyubei's explanation of how magical girls and witches exist opposing each other and existing only as representations of hope and despair, you can easily again connect some ideas from the fact the gems they use to sustain their magical abilities turn darker each time they use them, and can only be cured by using grief seeds obtained from witches. Grief seed is another extremely obvious name which keeps accentuating the problem of the show's foreshadowing. So by the time the series begins to formally reveal its central twists about who the witches are, what they represent, about what the soul gems are, and the grief seeds, and doesn't pull anything else on top of the already existing, easily predictable twists, it really weakens the experience. Not necessarily because the ideas themselves are flawed, but because the audience is never given the opportunity to arrive at them on their own. The same episode, Mami, Madoka, and Sayaka manage to defeat a witch together, even though Madoka and Sayaka possess no power. As a result, they obtain a grief seed, a physical manifestation of grief that is the core that creates that witch. Mami shows how it works by absorbing the same dark material part of her soul gem upon using her powers. There's a quite striking resemblance between soul gems and grief seeds, with them looking extremely similar to one another, if not straight up the same. You can very clearly see where this is going, denoting from the fact witches and magical girls are opposite from one another and represent two concepts, light and dark or hope and despair. So again, another big reveal that witches are magical girls who have left their soul gem be corrupted by the darkness is once again unsurprising, as most of the mysteries surrounding the mechanics and inner workings of this world are spoiled or implied way too heavily by the plot. The result of all this viewer hand-holding is that, to me at least, some of the emotional impact early on in the series is dampened, if not lesser to such an extent that it does not feel significant. Every single twist that the characters act surprised over felt to me like I had already known it with so much time in advance. It's unfortunately much worse when we're talking about the characters. I've said earlier how Urobochi really likes writing tragic characters and backstories tied to them, and his justification most of the time for tying them together to the plot is that death inherently brings an emotional response. It's just to get to that emotional response, both the build-up, the attachment, and the details surrounding the death must make sense to the viewers, lest the death feel in vain. Urobochi is really bad at doing the latter, making a death not feel pointless. Whenever a character dies in his stories, it results in one of two things. A. More tragedy, or a chain reaction that causes more death, essentially giving the viewer an immediate consequence to the action, or B. There is simply no impact, or the impact is so minimal it barely has any ramifications throughout the entire story. An important character can simply die, just for another to get sacrificed, and the story to treat the second death as lesser or of no impact. When the justification itself is also faulty, that compounds to the point where you feel betrayed by the writing. Yes, it's a tragedy. A terrible, terrible tragedy. What's happening is unfair and the world is cruel and evil, but most importantly, if the reasoning for death isn't good enough for the viewer, they feel cheated. The impact is gone. This is how I felt for most of the runtime of Madoka Magica. It all begins with the third episode. During this episode, the girls stumble upon a witch's domain out in the open, near the hospital where Sayaka's crush, a boy named Kyosuke, who suffered a terrible accident leaving both his hands unusable, is staying. Yet another tragedy in a long line, since he just happens to be a violin player and a really good one at that. That's besides the point. This witch right here at the hospital cannot be left alone, because of Sayaka's fear that it might attack the one she loves the most. Even then, that's a necessity of the magical girl's responsibility. So they decide to split up, send Sayaka with Kyubei inside the domain to reckon, while Madoka goes and gets Mami. When they both enter the domain, Madoka and Mami encounter Homura, who claims she will take out this witch in particular, knowing Mami hadn't encountered anything like that before. Even though Mami is shown to have quite sufficient experience and even lauds the girl's efforts to contain the witch before her arrival, she does a terrible decision upon meeting Homura. She decides to trap Homura using an extremely powerful ability of hers, which locks in place a target for a seemingly unlimited time. I think my main complaint with this is that Mami had had months of experience prior to that moment, and when warned about the dangers of this encounter, she still refuses to acknowledge it or take Homura's warning seriously. Instead, she reasons that Homura might betray her, and the lack of trust makes her incapacitate her, which in the long run ends up being a terrible choice, since she is going into battle with not only two people who possess no abilities, which she might need to protect, but against an unknown and warned against enemy. Even if she were to distrust Homura, she has proven herself to have a problem with just Kyubei so far, seemingly having no reason to hurt the other girls, since she warns both of them against turning into magical girls. The entirety of Mami's character this episode, and particularly in the other episode, for me screams outright that she's a dispensable secondary character, and her actions as well very clearly foreshadow what's about to come. It's also Mami's speech about being a role model, and the whole emotional turning point right before the fight with the monster, which makes it very clear her arc has long ended and she's about to die. It's such a telegraphed death, together with the dialogue and again plethora of bad choices being made for seemingly no apparent reason. As it was unfolding, I was getting madder watching it happen, especially her overconfidence at the end against the monster she just rushes. Her overconfidence results in her death. And while this death, like many others in the series, to me felt like it had the impact of a wet wipe hitting the floor, I actually don't think this one's purpose is entirely lost. It's one of the only deaths, if not the only, whose purpose is to build another's character. In this case, Sayaka gets so moved by this death, in particular she decides to finally become a magical girl. I actually like the outcome of this death, because it's one of the better written aspects of the series. It manages to instill a primal fear into Madoka, a knowledge that she could die, and pushes her away, and it does the exact opposite for Sayaka, where her will becomes formidably stronger with the wish to better herself and even become someone greater than Mami herself. Which quickly gets explored the very next episode, as Sayaka truly becomes a magical girl and manages to save her friends from danger and heal her crush's hands. The thing with this one in particular is that indeed the death works out as a story plot point in the afterwards. Its impact is minimal in the moment, but it forms itself into a sort of emotional crutch for the rest of the narrative structure, impacting every episode afterwards. In that sense, Mami is written into it simply to be killed off for character growth, which I still think is a rather bad writing practice and is just one of many things described above which worsen the experience of the attentive viewer. And I've been simply able to determine all of these tragedies, quote unquote, apparent cause are simply determined by an unnatural crafting of the character neurology. What I mean by that is simply that every character in the show is written in such a way that you don't really expect any of their actions. Not in that they're unpredictable, but that they're never proactive or make any decisions that would make logical sense. All but Homura, whose entire intention, I think, was to be written as a character whose actions don't make much sense to the uninitiated viewer, but it sort of has the entirely opposite effect. I can understand Homura's actions much better than any other characters, even if she doesn't have a concrete motivation to back each one up. That's in part because the other characters are also meant to be confused by her actions, because she's acting on parts to prior knowledge she has from this whole world being a time loop. As a result, she's more like an actor whose actions only seem confusing on the surface, when in reality they are motivated by arguably the most informed choices out of the entire main cast. Her choices in each part of the story are simply the apparent correct one, and there's rarely a single moment where she feels like she's in the wrong. As for the other characters, due to the number of fluctuations not only in personality but character intelligence and overall identity, they feel rather absurd. There are multiple examples of that in Madoka Magica, but I want to focus specifically to one in regard to Kyoko and her backstory. Kyoko is a character introduced around the 5th episode as a selfish, greedy, and overall malevolent person. She's quickly shown to have a lack of care for others and even a thirst for blood, as even the presence of one other magical girl in the city, which might end up stealing some of her grief seeds, leads her to consider murder. As she's introduced, she immediately fights Sayaka with the intention of outright killing her and almost succeeding in doing so, only retreating upon Homura's direct intervention. She also witnesses the death of Sayaka by her separation with the Soul Gem, which might perhaps explain her change of heart, if only they kept her character consistent. But that scene in particular comes as a shocker to me personally. Kyoko displays a level of concern for Sayaka that really isn't warranted, taking account she was just trying to kill her a few seconds ago. She still largely swings from having some of those old murderous or selfish ideals to rather strangely humanitarian causes, saving the world or helping others around her, even though those concepts do not align with the worldview she preaches at all. There's an entire conversation she has with Sayaka where she describes her way of life being one where she chose to never do anything for others around her, as she believes that it would only end in tragedy and suffering. There's a recurring contradiction with that statement, and it only alienates her further apart as she becomes a consistent member of the main cast, having helped Homura or Sayaka multiple times in a row, and even Madoka. The issue is not that she changes, but that the story does not fully bridge the gap between those two states. Her actions begin to reflect a different set of values than her worldview. This is what makes her position feel contrived. The story presents her as someone who has a hardened conclusion about the world she exists in, yet that conclusion does not meaningfully dictate her way of thinking or her behavior. Instead, it exists alongside actions that constantly contradict and undermine it, fact eventuated by the way she speaks of her own backstory herself. Both elements, she herself being a selfish prick and unwilling to adapt to work with others and having a sudden change of heart, feel completely out of character for her, after she tried really hard to kill Sayaka. It comes out of nowhere, and it's there for no reason other than to introduce a tragic backstory and for her to spout the line about wasting food, specifically about the fact she'd like to kill anyone who wastes food. Her reasoning being that she comes from a poor family. There are a few important points to be made about Kyoko's behavior, and that is mostly that the difficulty and trauma resulted from her past events and even the current ones are not relevant when criticizing her arc. The issue is not simply that she contradicts herself, but that those contradictions do not feel meaningfully earned or even logical in the moment she says them herself. Upon reaching a little church in the woods, Kyoko starts explaining how she got her powers, and specifically what she did with her own wish. She comes from a poor family, her father being a priest. He decided to shift the religion to accommodate for parts of it which to him seemed outdated, in order to make people more kind to each other. He's described as a good Samaritan priest with good intentions and a pure heart, a soft person who would even cry reading the morning paper. People stopped coming to his sermons due to his constant additions to the regular scripture. In wanting to make her father happy and her family stop starving, Kyoko goes ahead and makes a terrible choice. A choice she knows the consequences of and even says that in the story. She wishes for more people to come to her father's sermons, knowing fully well they would be controlled by magic. And of course, this choice should have resulted in her being kicked out of the family. I think that would have been all fine and dandy as a writing decision. The problem is Urobochi can't help himself. Even when he writes a character like a pure-hearted priest that's willing to adapt and change, one who is sensitive and loving to his family, he feels the need to write something completely and utterly out of character for him. The result of her action is really simple. Instead of preaching to her or helping his daughter, or even to consider it as a sign of bad omen, he calls his own daughter he loves so much a witch and immediately kills his own children and wife, and then himself. The priest's father, described as pure-hearted, amazing, sweet, kills his entire family. To me, this is just one of many parts of the story where the writing feels utterly forced to create an emotional reaction out of the viewer. The father's actions not only feel entirely disconnected from the character Urobochi himself wrote for the backstory, but it's a far cry from his description as a person. Because of that reason alone, even if this is indeed a tragedy, it cannot elicit from me a single coherent emotional response because of its contrived nature. It's also just one of many inconsistencies that plague the writing, as one of them that I particularly outlined above. This backstory is supposed to make us feel and understand the reasoning behind Kyoko's cold front and apparent selfishness, but only comes across as a frustrating explanation which only serves to accentuate the unsatisfying writing this character has. As I said, her way of thinking that helping others means not helping them, and that even when not helping others you are allowed to hurt them in order to avoid pain and suffering, still causes pain and suffering, is such a contrived line of thought that just explaining it in writing is difficult. To comprehend the logical sense of it to me feels rather impossible. The same episode, episode 7, Kyoko finally returns to school after a long time of being hospitalized. In a way, that's a triumph for Sayaka's character, but also not. I haven't really discussed much about side characters till now, but ironically enough, most side characters are generally written better than some of the main cast members. I think Kyosuke in particular is one of those examples, where I can personally see his backstory as one full of tragedy and still appreciate him for going on and on. He essentially lost the thing that was most dear to him, his own hands. Being a violent player, it makes him hate himself. When he lashes out at Sayaka in episode 4, he doesn't do it because he hates her for bringing him music, he does it out of a deep frustration. It's actually part of what drives her to become a magical girl in the first place, to be able to mend the one she loves. I rather think and believe that Sayaka is well written for the most part, and her motivation for most of the story connects perfectly to everything around her. It makes her an engrossing character, even if you occasionally face situations where she chooses to fight irrationally. Her entire motivation is tied to Kyosuke and Mami, characters whose arcs are both really strong. Speaking of strong characters with good arcs, the same applies to Madoka's mother, who at first is introduced as a character who's rather sleazy and work-centered, but as the series goes on, her conversations with Madoka prove to be more and more insightful. The only caveat is that she gives advice as though Madoka would simply be a normal middle school girl going through life. Her wisdom is well-intentioned but always results in some direct problem. She still proves herself to be a caring, loving mother to her own daughter. And while these two side characters are really nourished by the narrative, there's also cases where characters get, for the most case, neglected. I think that role would be filled by Hitomi, one of the original three friends that went together to school: Sayaka, Hitomi, and Madoka. While Hitomi is indeed an integral part of the story itself, she often feels like she exists simply to push some unresolved plot thread to a closure. She only appears in 3 or 4 episodes for brief periods. In her introduction, she's someone that comes from a rich family and is always busy. She then becomes the target of a witch attack and only exists to drag Madoka into an unescapable scenario, out of which she can be a damsel in distress by Sayaka, completing that specific arc. In relation to Sayaka's arc during the 7th episode, when she confronts her, saying she herself had developed a crush on Kyosuke and gives Sayaka 24 hours to act before she would take him away from her, she betrays Sayaka as she knows fully well how much time and effort she put into caring for Kyosuke, and the reaction I got brings my blood to a boil. In yet another surprise, this is quite a well-written arc. What I personally find less logical is Sayaka's reaction to this. Since the 6th episode when she got separated from her soul gem, she's been aware of the fact her body is no longer her own. It's an improved, more resistant one, which the Kyubey made specifically for her. This almost breaks her, while to me personally this isn't necessarily a rational reaction. It's not really about that, though, is it? Before that, even beyond the concept of feeling and acting effectively, there was a level of decision making on each character's part, even if they were acting entirely according to their own emotions. I'd argue that this is different because it matters in the way Sayaka perceives herself. Her cognition believes she's done a Faustian pact and has tainted herself to an unrecognizable amount. As such, she does not deserve to be with Kyosuke. In another act of tragedy, but this time one completely warranted by the plot, I think this is a fine enough complexation and makes Hitomi a much more interesting character than what she represented prior to this episode. This choice, however, would end up having a rather metric ton of ramifications, not only regarding to Sayaka's character, but regarding everyone else's as well. For the past few episodes, Homura has been telling everyone about the arrival of a certain being called the Walpurgisnacht, an ultimate witch which is foretold to bring about the end of the world. Homura wants them all to work together in defeating this witch, but requires the help of both Sayaka and Kyoko for this. We've actually seen the Walpurgisnacht in the dream Madoka had at the beginning of the series, and we know for a fact she alone cannot defeat it. Unfortunately for everyone, Sayaka runs away, overwhelmed by grief, and with her power spent from refusing to fulfill her soul gem up, most of the main cast is generally too busy infighting, which mostly comes down to, again, Homura being in the right while Kyoko continues making the worst informed decisions. And by the time they catch up to her, it's too late, as she turns into a witch right in front of Kyoko. This point is where undoubtedly, in my opinion, the story picks up, with most of the problems of the first 8 episodes being resolved. The second half of the anime is by far the best written arc of the entire thing, and it's where the emotional build-up, even if shoddy at best, kicks in full force, as all of the characters are driven to work together and the mystery begins to fully unfold, this time with twists that weren't necessarily as predictable as before. It also confirms that each witch's domain is entirely created on a background of trauma. Sayaka's witch domain looking exactly like a music hall, showing her ties not only to classical music but to Kyosuke as well. For the most part, this is an aspect of the show I really enjoyed. I think every single witch's domain is designed with the utmost care and has a rather unique look to it, glued together by a variety of visual artifacts, from bright colors and surreal imagery to papier-mâché-like image editing. I don't think there's ever going to be anything as visually distinct as these domains in the medium again, and I have only praise to assert to the series for that reason. I did say earlier that I wouldn't bring up the visuals or presentations unless absolutely necessary, however, and for that reason alone, I'll return to the plot and perhaps dedicate the last stretch of the video to the remaining notes I have about the overall aesthetic appearance and soundscape of the show. Immediately after escaping from Sayaka's domain, Homura and Kyoko are met with a dilemma. Homura insists that Sayaka has no way to be saved, while Kyoko, this time in an act of selflessness, perhaps a sign of growth, lashes out at her, thinking there's a way to reverse the process. As I've said earlier, Kyoko's overall messy personality and plethora of hard-to-argument personal philosophy ideas make a rather rigid and unpredictably written character, not really in a good way. This aspect is also shown throughout this entire episode, but not before the incubator can come into the picture and give an almost 10-minute exposition dump that simply reveals all of the mysteries of the magical girl's purpose. In this exposition dump, we learn that all magical girls are made to be turned into raw energy. Whenever their gems get corrupted and they turn to witches, they release a massive amount of energy into the atmospheres, which gets collected by the incubators. The incubators, like Kyubei, have no emotions and purely exist in a state where they fail to comprehend actions that to them seem illogical. The only reasons they've chosen humanity in the first place as the place to initiate the project is that they realized humans would be the only ones capable of producing such strong emotional responses. Simply put, most of the other races in space consider this emotive quality a mental disorder of the species. Essentially, everyone up there is a psychopath, pure and simple. I also don't necessarily understand why, despite the fact humans can produce a seemingly infinite amount of energy by having multiple generations turn into these magical girls and then turn to witches, why do the incubators still bring about an all-powerful witch to end the world? Is that more like a naturally occurring event? And wouldn't that also threaten their energy production levels? There are many questions which logically make absolutely no sense. We can assume everything Kyubei says in this conversation is true, and if that's simply the case, then those questions would remain unanswered. But there's one thing it adds in the middle of it all, which has already been really obvious from the beginning. It's omitting information from the main cast and lying. fact which we've known for very long before it itself says it. That means there's also always quite an easily deducted explanation from each time something Kyubey said is untrue or weirdly absent. Oh, we just lied. Which I don't like at all writing wise because it's utterly reductive. They can have this entire exposition spiel featuring every detail that just comes out to be true, except we don't really know why they chose to end this world. And actually, anything he said could have been untrue. We'll just change anything whenever it's plot convenient. This really reductive line of reasoning in Urobochi's writing unfortunately is what brought me to write this video, and it's something that continues to extend to the characters he writes. As even though we've seen Kyubey lie over and over again, when it turns to Kyoko the possibility of maybe having a way of saving her friend Sayaka from being a witch, she immediately falls for the bait. It's quite egregious and even more so accentuated by the fact Kyoko knows very well that without her all of humanity might as well be destroyed, and their chances of fighting the world-ending threat of the Walpurgisnacht might simply become zero. Yet she still chooses to go forward with basically no plan. She also involves Madoka into this and ends up dying in the process. There's nothing more for me to add. Their plan is simply to run up to Sayaka in her witch form and scream her name until maybe she recognizes them. Of course it fails miserably, it's badly thought out, it's not even a last resort, and they execute it without even consulting with Homura before. Throughout the entire runtime of this video, I've criticized Urobochi's tendency to rely on cheap tricks and easy ways out to make his writings tragically sad, to make characters suffer, and I know for a fact people will have the counter argument to everything I'm saying by simply pointing out that, oh, they're middle schoolers, of course they make bad choices. And again, it's reductive. This doesn't really excuse the fact that the writing is simply cheap and uses such tricks. Characters always, and I mean always, make the perfect choice to inch closer towards a tragic conclusion. Other than the fact they're people, they never act like people. They never act proactively or even make informed decisions that a normal person would. Which would be fine and all, but every single time, without a doubt, they get entirely punished for it by being beaten, by being killed, by having their families die, by having their loved ones abandon them, and none of it feels earned. It's lazy and circular logic, and above all else, thought terminating. Any single argument you could make towards the writing being inconsistent in quality can just be excused by using arguments like they're middle schoolers, the incubator was lying, the entire point of it is that it's tragic. And then people would compound onto that it being a tragedy in itself means you already know it's going to happen and the tragic events still happen at the end of the day. But what I'm saying is simply that the tragedy is unearned. It's suffering for the sake of suffering, and it makes every single character and plot point feel like you're just screaming at the screen, don't do that, Madoka, or don't do that, Sayaka, and then just doing it either way. It's reductive in spite of it being tragic, because it removes the conditions that make tragedy meaningful in the first place. After the 9th episode and Kyoko's death, the series simply departs and attempts to introduce Homura's backstory, showing us how she became as good as she was and revealing the fact the whole show has been an ongoing time loop. Which doesn't really come as a surprise either, as it's part of the mystery much like the rest, which is far too well telegraphed to be missed even before that. That begins not only with the dream premonition at the start being far too explicit, but also Homura knowing a lot about everyone before even meeting them and her possessing time-related abilities. She clearly seemed to know more than she was leading on to believe, and her adventures in the multiple timelines justify her actions perfectly. Because once again, the tragic backstory of all characters comes into play. In episode 10, in which we see her backstory, we have multiple characters' arcs, hinges and failures fall on her part, just out of the writer's need to make everything a tragedy. Anyways, her backstory is quite simple. In every single universe she's had to witness Madoka and everyone else die. She's only become a magical girl at the end of the first universe by wishing she could redo the events of the universe, but to be the one strong enough to protect Madoka this time. Still, she fails and has to restart the universe right from the start each time, sometimes clashing directly with the in-universe versions of the main cast, which provide seemingly more and more absurd reasons to not trust Homura despite her abilities to prove herself that she can manipulate time. It gets absurd at one point. Everything the characters do in the other universes upon Homura explaining what she knows and having proved her abilities to them is completely and utterly illogic. It only exists there to make you feel more closer to her and see all her failures, but it's badly written and tied together. The result of the writing decision of Homura suffering is indeed one positive for the plot development, and that matters a lot, but that still cannot excuse the fact some of the reasonings are beyond naive. She clearly does not want to harm them, and even tries explaining herself as much as she could in each one of the early universes. Still, she gets shunned away by the main cast, and more tragedy follows for absolutely the most absurd of reasonings. Homura proves she can manipulate time and comes from another universe, and the main cast just shun her away because her weapon of choice is explosives. That is a real line said by Mami, where she literally has no other reasons other than Homura's aggression towards the incubator. Even when she switches from bombs, she still does not earn their full trust, and that ends up costing them all. Eventually that reaches the current universe, where we can add to the logistics of her wish for Madoka not to become a magical girl. The one time she manages to become one, during the very long time loop section, she ends up destroying the entire planet by becoming the most powerful witch ever seen. Entering episode 11, we're finally explained why that happened. The series attributes this to the idea of karmic accumulation. The notion that because Homura continues to return to the same point in time, Madoka's life is becoming increasingly significant across those repeated timelines. In theory, this means that her potential continues to grow, eventually reaching a point where if she becomes a magical girl, she also becomes the most powerful witch imaginable. But the way this is presented raises more questions than it answers, in my personal opinion, mainly stemming from what Homura's wish was and what the results of it are. The concept of karmic weight is introduced as an explanation for why Madoka's simply becoming more powerful and isn't really a system defined by any subset of rules. It's simply a justification the audience can quickly comprehend, so it does not take from the runtime. And it's also contradicted by Homura's wish for her to go back in time and be strong enough to protect Madoka. Yet her own strength remains relatively consistent, while Madoka's grows exponentially instead. Homura is the one creating the time loop, the one experiencing each iteration, and the one whose entire existence becomes centered around this singular goal. So the writing's logic is flawed simply because the ideas it uses are utterly uneven. It's simply a selective explanation for a concept only wherever it is necessary in order to keep the narrative as uncomplicated as possible. In the end, despite Homura's wishes because the world is ending, Madoka still has to become a magical girl. But now the plot gets circumvented by the fact the world has been reset so many times, she has the abilities to turn into an omnipresent god. This makes most, if not all of their actions essentially pointless. If only Madoka had known what to wish for from the start, none of this would have happened. But of course, she couldn't have known. She appears all across time, comforting each magical girl and cleansing them for their deaths to simply be peaceful. In one of the scenes, she helps Anne Frank for whatever reason. I can't imagine many of these were thought out, like you're telling me Anne Frank was a magical girl fighting witches in the concentration camps? Either way, because of Madoka's wish to erase every single witch in the universe, and for no magical girls to suffer anymore, she causes a rift that creates too much hope in the universe. So an equal amount of despair has to be formed to counteract it. She essentially becomes a god whose purpose is solely to comfort the dying magical girls and stop witches from ever existing again. In her final moments of consciousness in the astral plane, Homura gets handed Madoka's bow as a parting gift, and a new universe is born. Sayaka's arc finally ends with her seeing Kyosuke play the violin, a moment which shows the love in her heart still burns. We also get to see what happens to all of the other characters, and every single outcome is generally a nice touch, bringing a definite conclusion to the series. While it's bittersweet, I can appreciate it for what it is, and I feel like despite all the shoddily written moving parts of the narrative, the ending still manages to be engrossing. Simply put, in this case the emotional resolution it provides is simply the result of Homura and Madoka themselves being strongly written characters. And the martyred nature being something universally human, wanting your fellow peers to exist without suffering even if your sacrifice is greater than ever. Still, this ending suffers from many the same problems the rest of the show does, where it's not necessarily subversive or unique in itself. It feels rather deliberate and predictable that it would inevitably end in Madoka's sacrifice, and while that dampens the impact of the ending by quite a bit, I'm actually happy this time to mention that it does not ruin it. But there's also a few choices which quite literally baffle me. Kyoko is brought back to life, Mami too, but Sayaka remains dead despite no tangible reason being given. It's also still a tragedy. one I've spent so much time already detailing my main problems with, and one that still, despite all, finds ways to dismiss some rather simple solutions to otherwise lackluster writing. Fortunately enough, it's also a show with amazing visuals, a lot of it in part due to it being a Shaft production. A lot of Monogatari influence can be seen everywhere, from the backgrounds to some direct shots comparison, and even certain accents and almost all voice actors being shared between the two. As I said before, I really enjoyed the visual details and world building of the witches' inner workings. I mostly came down to how they were designed, sounded and looked. I can't talk much about the soundtrack unfortunately, as most of it is heavily copyrighted, but I can tell you with certainty it's really good. So in the end, I don't think Madoka Magica is necessarily a bad series. There are clearly some strong ideas at its core, and moments where those ideas can sometimes successfully come together in a way that feels rather satisfying. But the problem for me lies in the writing. Many of these ideas are underdeveloped, badly explored, or held back by a narrative structure that often values hype moments and aura, and dark pasts, and it's so sad as reactions. The narrative simultaneously feels over-explained and under-explained. It's all very in your face and easy to understand, yet never feels satisfying, so it baits you into believing you're missing something, when in reality that is never the case. Its tragedy is too tightly controlled and forced too often to feel fully earned. And because of that and a variety of issues I've outlined in this essay, what should have been a deeply compelling story ends up feeling rather uneven to me. At times frustrating, in others engaging, not because it's lacking any substance, but because Urobochi doesn't trust his own concepts enough to let them breathe and develop out some of the simplistic ideas the story introduces. Same thing applies with the characters, with them just being killed off every single time for really stupid reasoning. To that extent, it simply shows a distrust of conscience on the audience's part that Madoka Magica simply imparts. Most characters in the show aren't written to be goal-oriented, and for that reason alone perhaps the only two that feel like they have conclusive arcs are Sayaka and Homura. Most of the other characters, as I've outlined numerous times above, are simply written in an outright absurd manner, and their actions only exist to consistently cause trauma. By this point, I'd gotten tired. I'd been thinking about Madoka Magica for so long, when finally something clicked. I've played these games before. Elfen Lied is a 2004 anime that presents cute anime girls going through repeated tragedies as a result of a chain of bad actions which seem to result simply from misguided efforts on their parts. Sound familiar? Yeah, that's because both Madoka Magica and Elfen Lied fall into a genre promptly named moe drama. And while Elfen Lied is often considered online one of the biggest pieces of trash of the medium, the same cannot be said about Madoka Magica, which is odd since they both fall into exactly the same pitfalls. As I've said, the one thing Madoka does really well is wrap up its emotional ending, right? And I think that's where the deviation comes. Most of the people watching Madoka simply remember it for the latter half instead of the earlier one. And while they might have had their gripes with it, it's amazing what the power of emotions can do in overriding one's better judgment. And that is all because moe drama is particularly frustrating as a genre. It leans heavily on the suffering of its characters as a way to generate engagement, and often assumes that the emotional response alone will carry the experience, even when the underlying writing does not fully support it, or is not qualitative enough to hold the weight of the narrative. You may ask yourself, okay, but why don't the writers and people like Urobochi actually give a fuck about this consistency error? It's really simple actually. The writers know all too well that most viewers will gladly put up with all this shit so long as they get their cute girls in anguish that they can fantasize about consoling. Point in case, Madoka Magica. So what happens when you write a story whose character simply cannot make a single good decisions, where every single outcome is tragic because it needs to create an emotion, and there's simply no vindication or good course of action taken? Well, my friend, you've inadvertently written the best accidental idiot plot of your life. What is an idiot plot, you ask? Well, in literary criticism, an idiot plot is one which is kept in motion solely by virtue of the fact that everybody involved is an idiot, and where the story would quickly end or possibly not even happen if this were not the case. It is a narrative where its conflict comes from the characters not recognizing or not being told key information that would resolve the conflict, often because of plot contrivance. The only thing that prevents the conflict's resolution is the character's constant avoidance or obliviousness of it throughout the plot, even if it was already obvious to the viewer. so the characters are all idiots in that they are too obtuse to simply resolve the conflict immediately. And while in this case there's a lot of really stupid decisions, I disagree that the plot could be resolved immediately if some better decisions would be made. It mostly boils down to Madoka's wish, and actually everybody's wishes, since they've been given the most easily abusable system ever made. Noted by the fact Homura's wish as a low-level magical girl impacts the course of the plot so much. So maybe in some way it could be solved as such, but still. There's a lot of what-if scenarios where I don't see why the characters wouldn't have made a better choice. You can simply drive the point that it's all a big fell for it again a word loop, where each single character, despite making terrible mistakes which should get them immediately to reconsider their course of action, keep making the same mistakes over and over again. And you could argue a lot of those problems also stem from the show's short runtime, making foreshadowing all but impossible with the number of concepts Robochi was desperately trying to cram into Madoka. If something is foreshadowed, it's done so obviously you could see it from a mile away coming. Or it isn't done at all and comes together as shock twist for shock value. It's really sad how its over-reliance on that nullified all emotional impact the show had up until the very end. I feel like I could barely feel a modicum of sadness for all these characters, because I knew they were just going to suffer more and more. And the plot just kept punishing them. It got to the point where I had felt that all this was building up towards was a big pointless torture porn, finally. Where everyone dies and nothing can truly be saved. And that's sort of the point. You know, when you have writers like Robochi who say things like they only have contempt for the feeling of happiness, this is the stories you end up writing. Rushed, unfulfilling, unexplained and contrived messes that, despite all their objective flaws from a structural perspective and all someone else could believe about subjectively, still get to become quote-unquote undefeated masterpieces and perfect anime, and get to be studied as perfect examples of all the things you should do in a story. That is without mentioning much of the plot holes which are actually part of many explanations the show provides, like Homura's wish and it increasing Madoka's power, like the fact middle school girls are the only, and I mean only, group targeted by the incubators. The fact that magical girls are almost always adolescents is explained through this idea that they are emotionally volatile at that age. That alone already opens up a lot of questions that the series never really seems interested in answering. Boys of the same age go through the same kind of turmoil, often in just as intense ways. Even beyond that, there are people across all ages who experience far more extreme emotional states, people dealing with trauma, loss or psychological disorders. Yet the writing simply locks it as such because it's the easiest way, without ever giving the audience the why. And the same thing applies to almost all justifications. And then it just simply ends. After spending so much time building a world filled with despair and trying to bring together the idea of hope, Madoka's wish simply nullifies everything the series had built up to. Yet still, that's still by far the best written part out of the whole thing, because it finally gives a payoff after so much time to all the emotional suffering the characters went through. And yet still, despite all of my complaints and my bickering, my mean remarks and everything I've said above, I really don't think Madoka is an average show. I cannot hate the series for all these shortcomings, but I also cannot ignore them blindly, burying my head in the sand just to be a turkey. The presentation elevates everything by a lot. The visual design of the witch, domains, the direction, and especially the music all contributes to an atmosphere that is genuinely unique within the medium. So for me, what's left is simply a series that I can respect, but can never fully enjoy. One that only managed to entertain me for a bit, and then, unfortunately, disappoint me. Well, you know, not entirely. I liked aspects of it, but I wasn't finished with it by far. At all. After the show's release, what quickly followed was the planning of an additional Madoka movie, which would try to continue the story further. From what is said around the net and everywhere else, Robochi merely joked about it, but Shaft decided they were going to do it, so he had to come on board and write again. While they were preparing for that, they released 2 recap movies, which are some sorts of light remakes. I think watching these over the original is kind of pointless, as they're merely recut versions of what's already in the show. There are, however, a few additional scenes which add extra parts to some of the system's explanations. which really don't solve any of my issues with them at all, as it feels like some of the systems that were already over-explained get compounded by the newly added runtime. The first two movies aren't great, and they sort of feel like you're wasting your time if you watch them immediately coming off the series. I think they're fine as long as you've been off it for a long time, otherwise not really worth rewatching the entire thing for basically no apparent reason. It's also strangely paced, with the first movie alone having 8 episodes, while the second one only covers the remaining 5, instead of it being 6 and 6. The runtimes also show that, with the first movie being 30 minutes longer, despite having 3 more episodes of content within itself. Leaving that aside, for the third movie, it was decided from the beginning that it would be a continuation of the plot. And to that, all I have to say before even voicing my opinions about the thing is simply why. Why is this a thing? The anime had a conclusive ending with a very nice wrap up of the events, and while the ending had a lot of tragedy part of itself and its identity, it was good nonetheless. It was the part of the anime that felt most conclusive. Despite that, going into the third movie, I was left pleasantly surprised by how much I enjoyed it. That mostly comes down, for the most part, to Rebellion treating its central mystery, which the plot starts off, smart. It does not treat the viewer like a child and gives them a certain amount of leeway in a way that Foreshadowing hides pretty well. There are a lot of theories that can be crafted upon each element of the story being introduced, which do blend together extremely nicely this time around. It's a story where the beginning shows an idyllic universe in which the magical girls' jobs are eased by all that is around them, where witches don't exist and corrupting of soul gems isn't real. Furthermore, it's a universe where both Homura and Madoka can exist as magical girls and not suffer through immense turmoil. It's really beautiful, not only as an idea, but visually this is some of the most stunning work Shaft has ever done. The music is great, and as the mystery was being built deeper with strange twists about the city they live in being the only one that exists on Earth, it was all very interesting and well drawn. I was really engaged. The characters I had problems with previously, like Kyoko, were better written and actually had their fair share of moments where they make great decisions in the plot. Still, most of the plot is pushed forward by Homura, since she is the main character this time around. But that doesn't stop characters like Mami and Kyoko from getting a lot of attention in their behavior. For the first 3/3, this plot plays out impeccably, even up to the reveal that this whole universe is a witch's domain. Here is where some deviations start. Homura goes on her own and tries to kill a thing called Charlotte, which is actually a sort of magical girl named Momoe. It's kind of hard to understand what's happening, but her theory is that the witch that killed Mami in the previous universe is the one creating this illusion. So she attacks it without consulting with others, then fights with Mami over it, only to later realize Kyubei has turned Homura into a witch. Because of her explanation at the end of the series to Kyubei, it gave the incubators the idea to make witches a real thing, since they did not exist in this universe. So based off Homura's explanation, they reverse engineered the witch, in the form of Homura herself, captured in a glass shard. Everything is made from her memory. Of course, the dilemma comes from keeping the idyllic state or escaping it to the real world truth. Having that as a choice weighs each character's roles down. This eventually results in a big fight where the purpose of the magical girls is to break the glass so that Madoka can remember she is the cycle of rebirth within this universe. They manage to do that, and Madoka knows it is time to take Homura away. Only problem is Homura decides she wishes for Madoka to live a normal life instead of one where she's tortured for all eternity. So she takes Madoka's hand and intentionally corrupts her gem, and somehow turns into the greatest evil of the universe. Again, it's not really explained, but afterwards she's supposedly become omnipresent. Now, instead of keeping an order, she does something. I'm actually not sure what her role is or why exactly she is evil. But everything, and I mean rather the entire story, just abruptly ends here. To say that Homura's 180-degree turn as a character was a massive asspull would be an understatement. And to continue with that and say that it actually makes sense in context only adds more and more to the issue, because one of the film's biggest problems is that it completely breaks one of the most basic rules of visual storytelling. show, don't tell. Whenever it briefly remembers that it actually has a story to tell, the characters just start explaining themselves out loud. They spell out their emotions, their motivations, everything as if they're reading directly from a wiki page. The worst example of this is the scene between Homura and Madoka in the flower field. This should have been a huge emotional turning point, but instead it just comes out of nowhere. Homura suddenly breaks down and dumps everything she feels onto Madoka with almost no real build-up. There's barely any foreshadowing leading into it, so the moment just feels hollow. And it doesn't help that Madoka herself has barely been a character up to that point. The story has spent far more time focusing on Homura's conflicts with everyone else. The film wants to feel like a tragic fall from grace, a gradual change in Homura from the angel Lucifer to the fallen angel Satan. But this is simply not earned. If her motivations were always meant to be selfish, if she truly wanted to be with Madoka no matter the cost, then why doesn't the story actually explore that in a meaningful way? Why doesn't she make that choice earlier, especially once she realizes that the Madoka she's with is real? It's very sudden and at the end only feels like the film needed a big twist and just shoved it in at the last minute. I've seen people say that you need multiple viewings to fully understand the film's more deeper themes, but honestly I don't buy that at all. You get the gist of it the first time. Most of the movie is just a surface level spectacle, a constant barrage of visual excess and fan service, with Shaft flexing their budget at every opportunity, almost turning to the viewer to scream, "Here is how much money we get from Madoka." And then the final portion just walks back the ending of the original series, so it can present itself as darker, more controversial, more mature story that has none of the grace of it. And it's all for the reason choices like these are always made: money. I've heard Urobochi didn't actually mean to end it that way, but there was a last minute decision that led to this weird ending. I personally don't buy that, not entirely, and if it was the case, even more of a reason to dunk on it. Apart from that, it's just very surface level. You get all the obvious symbolism. Madoka as a god figure, Homura as a fallen angel, but it never goes beyond that surface level. It feels like all genuine thematic depth has been sapped and dressed up to what is essentially a setup for more sequels. Because there is no way that ending is meant to feel like a real conclusion. It doesn't resolve anything, it just opens up the door for more. And lo and behold, guess what? There's another movie announced that's going to come out in August. Wow. Just wow. I would still recommend watching it, if only to see how completely it falls apart by the end. But honestly, the only reason I can see myself coming back to it is for how visually impressive it is, because as a story it just doesn't hold together. And that mostly stands true for all of Madoka Magica. Perhaps the only reason this movie is like that because of the setup for the subsequent sequels. It still could have been non-conclusive and good at ending the movie at the same time, but it was neither. Still, Rebellion and the end of the series represent my favorite parts of Madoka Magica. There's this idea that if something is confusing enough, abstract enough, symbolic enough, it must be meaningful. But meaning does not exist in a void, and while Madoka's attempts at storytelling are commendable, they aren't great. So what you're left with is a rather mediocre story, which I've criticized over the course of many words. Of course, you could argue that part of the experience is also to engage with the PSP game or the gacha game they released or the side series based on the gacha game, but I digress. It serves me no interest right now. They are subjects which I may cover another day, perhaps when the fourth movie finally comes out. So, what is my opinion on Madoka? It's a series I like sometimes, and one that fails me miserably other times. It's inconsistent, but above all, it's better than a lot of attempts in the medium. It's hard to rate or explain why I feel that way, but I think despite all my criticism, I like it. I'm not scared to criticize parts of it despite that, and I sort of wish this hapless happiness shown in all fandom culture to go away. People should express their problems with things they like. In the end, I've said all that need to be said. It's just on your shoulders now. What do you think of Madoka Magica?